You might want to check that file again before you decide who belongs in this courtroom. The words were calm, almost quiet, but they landed in the packed chamber like a stone dropped into still water. A few heads turned. Others didn't bother. To most of the people sitting on the polished wooden benches of Courtroom 3B that morning, the woman standing near the defense table looked ordinary. Mid-30s, dark suit, posture straight but relaxed. No uniform, no insignia, nothing that hinted at authority. Just another black woman waiting for her turn in a system that often made people wait a long time. Sunlight spilled through the tall courthouse windows, stretching long pale lines across the marble floor, dust drifting lazily in the warm beam of late morning light. The quiet hum of whispered conversations filled the room until a sharp voice cut through it. "Ma'am, you need to step back from the table." Officer Derek Coleman stood near the aisle, his hand resting firmly on the edge of the desk, as if claiming the space. He had the confident stance of someone used to being obeyed inside these walls. His badge caught the light, flashing briefly as he shifted his weight. The courtroom settled, the air tightening just a little. The woman didn't move right away. Instead, she looked at him with a steady expression that revealed nothing. No anger, no fear, only patience. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied quietly. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. Coleman frowned, clearly not used to calm resistance. He stepped closer, the soft squeak of his polished shoes echoing faintly against the marble floor. "I said step back," he repeated, voice louder now, the kind of tone meant to remind everyone who held authority in the room. For a moment, it seemed like the tension might dissolve into the ordinary rhythm of courtroom control. But something about the woman's stillness made the moment stretch. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply adjusted the folder resting on the defense table, fingers steady, movements precise, as if the room around her didn't belong to anyone but the law itself. The judge had not yet entered. The court clerk was organizing documents near the bench. The gallery leaned forward just slightly, sensing that something unusual was unfolding in the quiet space between authority and restraint. Officer Coleman reached out, as if to guide her away from the table. The gesture looked routine, the kind of movement seen 100 times in courtrooms across the country. But the second his hand made contact, the moment changed. Not with chaos, not with shouting, with control. The woman moved with calm efficiency, one smooth motion that shifted his balance just enough to stop him in place without causing harm. The entire courtroom froze. Coleman blinked in confusion, his confidence faltering for the first time as murmurs rippled through the gallery benches. The woman released him just as quickly as she had moved, stepping back half a foot, posture composed, hands resting lightly at her sides. Silence spread across the room like a held breath. Somewhere near the front row, someone whispered, barely audible, "Who is she?" At the bench, the court clerk finally glanced down at the case file resting open in front of her. Her eyes scanned a line of text, then another. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly before she looked up again at the woman standing calmly beside the defense table. And in that quiet pause, before anyone else realized it, the entire story inside that courtroom began to turn. The silence in the courtroom lingered longer than anyone expected. Dust drifted slowly through the warm sunlight pouring from the tall windows, and the faint ticking of the wall clock suddenly sounded louder than it should have. Officer Derek Coleman cleared his throat and straightened his uniform, attempting to reclaim the confidence that had slipped from him seconds earlier. A few people in the gallery leaned closer to one another, whispering quietly behind folded hands. Moments before, the room had been routine, predictable, another ordinary morning in a busy courthouse. Now the air carried a different weight, the subtle tension that appears when people sense that something important is unfolding. The woman standing near the defense table remained perfectly still. Her shoulders were relaxed, her hands resting calmly at her sides, and her eyes followed the slow movements around the room without the slightest sign of agitation. She looked like someone who had spent a long time learning how to wait without losing control of the moment. Officer Coleman glanced toward the clerk's desk, clearly expecting the situation to return to normal. "This area is restricted," he said again, though his voice sounded slightly less certain this time. "You cannot stand here unless you are part of the legal team." The woman tilted her head slightly, considering the words with quiet patience. "I am aware of the rules," she replied in the same steady tone. Several people in the gallery noticed the calm confidence in her voice. It was not defiance, and it was not submission. It was something else entirely, the kind of composure that often comes from experience rather than argument. At the bench, the court clerk continued reading the file in front of her. Her brow slowly tightened as she reached the next page. The file was thicker than most routine cases, filled with official forms and documentation that carried multiple government seals. She paused, then looked again at the name printed across the top of the page. The clerk lifted her eyes toward the woman standing by the defense table, studying her for a moment as if seeing her for the first time. The courtroom doors creaked softly as a late arrival slipped into the back row, but the small movement did not break the growing stillness in the room. Even Officer Coleman seemed to notice that something was shifting. "Ma'am," he said, forcing his voice back into its earlier firmness. "Please move away from the table until the judge arrives." The woman gave a small nod, not as a sign of surrender, but as acknowledgement that she had heard him clearly. She reached down and adjusted the folder in front of her, aligning the papers with careful precision. The action was small, almost routine, yet the deliberate way she moved suggested discipline that extended far beyond the walls of a courthouse. The murmurs in the gallery grew slightly louder. A man near the aisle leaned toward his neighbor and whispered, "She does not look nervous at all." His neighbor shook his head slowly. "That is not the look of someone who is worried," he replied under his breath. Near the clerk's desk, the file finally closed with a soft thud. The clerk inhaled quietly, her expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to surprise. She stood and carried the document toward the bench where the judge would soon sit. The woman near the defense table did not follow the movement with her eyes. Instead, she looked straight ahead at the empty chair behind the bench, as though she had already been waiting for this exact moment. Officer Coleman folded his arms and watched her carefully now, the earlier certainty in his posture replaced by cautious attention. For the first time since the morning had begun, the courtroom felt less like a place of routine procedure and more like the beginning of a story that no one present had expected to witness. The courtroom clock clicked softly toward the next minute, each second stretching the silence that had settled across the room. People shifted slightly in their seats, the wooden benches creaking under small movements as curiosity replaced routine boredom. Near the aisle, Officer Derek Coleman remained standing with his arms folded, watching the woman beside the defense table more carefully now. His earlier confidence had faded into something quieter, something closer to suspicion. The woman did not react to the attention. Her gaze stayed steady on the empty bench where the judge would soon appear, her posture calm in a way that suggested patience rather than hesitation. Sunlight continued to spill across the marble floor, reflecting faintly off the polished brass rail that separated the gallery from the front of the courtroom. Somewhere behind the benches, a cell phone vibrated briefly before being silenced. The room returned to stillness again. At the clerk's desk, the thick case file rested open beside the calendar of the day's hearings. The clerk glanced down once more, scanning the printed lines carefully, as if confirming what she had already read. The name on the document seemed to hold more weight with every passing second. She adjusted her glasses and slowly exhaled. In most cases, the paperwork was straightforward, another routine entry into the endless system of filings and appearances. This file was different. It carried the kind of credentials that rarely appeared inside a local courthouse. Across the room, two attorneys whispered quietly while pretending to organize their legal pads. "Something about this case is unusual," one of them murmured. The other nodded, keeping his voice low. "You can feel it in the room." Officer Coleman shifted his stance and looked again at the woman near the table. "You still have not explained why you are standing there," he said, his tone less sharp than before, but still firm enough to remind everyone of his authority inside the courtroom. The woman finally turned her head slightly toward him. Her expression remained composed, the same calm focus she had carried since the moment she walked through the courthouse doors earlier that morning. "I am waiting for the judge," she said simply. The answer sounded so ordinary that a few people in the gallery exchanged puzzled looks. Everyone in the room was waiting for the judge, yet the quiet certainty in her voice made the words feel different, as if she knew something the rest of them did not. Near the front bench, the clerk gently closed the file and placed it on the polished surface where the judge would soon sit. She looked again toward the woman, studying her posture, the steady way she held herself, the deliberate calm in her movements. Discipline. That was the word forming in her mind. Not the nervous tension of someone facing court proceedings, but the quiet control of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations. The courtroom doors opened again as a bailiff stepped inside and walked briskly toward the bench. "All rise will be called shortly," he announced. The murmurs faded immediately as people straightened in their seats. The air seemed to shift once more, the anticipation now thicker than before. Officer Coleman adjusted his uniform collar and glanced toward the bench, then back at the woman. For the first time that morning, a small crease appeared between his brows, a sign that uncertainty had begun to replace his earlier assumptions. The woman remained exactly where she had been standing, her attention returning to the empty judge's chair. She breathed slowly and evenly, as if the unfolding moment around her was simply another step in a long journey she had already prepared for. And as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway beyond the courtroom doors, the quiet story that had begun with confusion now moved one step closer to revelation. The echo of measured footsteps approached from the hallway beyond the courtroom doors, each step carrying a quiet authority that gradually settled the restless murmurs inside the room. Conversations faded. Papers stopped rustling. Even the faint squeak of shifting benches disappeared as people straightened in their seats. The bailiff moved to his position near the bench and glanced once toward the entrance before announcing in a clear voice that carried across the chamber that the court was about to come to order. Everyone rose. The motion happened almost instantly, a wave of bodies standing in practiced respect. Officer Derek Coleman stood as well, adjusting his stance beside the aisle, his eyes briefly scanning the room before landing again on the woman near the defense table. She rose with the rest of the courtroom, her movements smooth and unhurried, as if the moment held no surprise for her at all. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered through the side door behind the bench, her black robe moving gently as she walked to her seat. Her presence changed the atmosphere immediately. The judge carried a calm authority that quieted the room without effort. She sat down, placed her hands on the polished wood of the bench, and nodded once toward the clerk. The courtroom followed with the soft sound of dozens of people returning to their seats. The judge glanced briefly across the gallery, then toward the attorneys gathered near the front tables. Her attention moved through the room with practiced efficiency until it reached the defense table where the woman stood. For a moment the judge paused. The pause was small, subtle enough that only the most attentive observers might notice it, but it was there. Judge Whitmore's eyes flicked down toward the file resting on the bench in front of her. She opened it slowly, turning the first page with careful precision. The clerk watched quietly from the side, already aware of what the document contained. Across the aisle, Officer Coleman shifted slightly again, folding his hands behind his back as he tried to regain the confident posture expected of courtroom security. Yet his attention remained fixed on the woman near the table. Something about her calm presence had unsettled the certainty he had carried earlier that morning. The judge continued reading, her eyes moving line by line through the information printed in the file. The courtroom waited in silence. Sunlight from the high windows now stretched farther across the marble floor, bright enough to catch the edges of the wooden desks and the brass rail that separated the gallery. Finally, Judge Whitmore looked up from the document and studied the woman for several seconds. "Please state your name for the record," she said, her voice steady and clear. The woman stepped forward half a pace, her hands resting lightly on the table as she answered. "Commander Maya Jackson." The name moved through the courtroom like a quiet ripple. Some people glanced at one another. Others leaned slightly forward, sensing that the moment carried more significance than a routine introduction. The judge nodded slowly, as if confirming what she had just read. She glanced down once more at the file, and then back toward the woman. "Commander Jackson," she repeated, the title now clearly acknowledged in her tone. Officer Coleman's posture stiffened almost immediately. The single word commander seemed to echo louder in his mind than anything else spoken that morning. The judge closed the file gently and rested her hands on the bench again. Around the room, curiosity spread through the quiet audience. No one spoke, yet the shift in attention was unmistakable. The woman who had appeared to be an ordinary participant in the proceedings only minutes earlier now stood at the center of the courtroom with a title that carried a weight most people in the room did not yet fully understand. And as Officer Coleman looked again at Commander Maya Jackson, the certainty he once felt about the situation began to dissolve into something far more complicated. The quiet ripple caused by the judge's words had not yet faded when the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted once more. Commander Maya Jackson stood calmly beside the defense table, her posture straight, her expression composed, as if the attention of the entire room resting on her shoulders meant nothing at all. Judge Eleanor Whitmore studied her for another moment before glancing down again at the file in front of her. The pages held more than a simple name and title. They contained years of service records, commendations, and documentation that most people in the room would never see in their lifetime. The judge turned another page slowly, the soft sound of paper moving across polished wood echoing faintly through the quiet chamber. Officer Derek Coleman remained near the aisle, his earlier certainty now replaced with a careful stillness. The word commander continued to echo in his thoughts. It was not a title he expected to hear attached to the woman he had addressed so confidently only minutes earlier. He cleared his throat softly and shifted his weight, his eyes moving between the judge and the woman at the table. In the gallery, several spectators leaned forward slightly, curiosity building with each passing second. The courtroom had begun the morning expecting an ordinary hearing. Instead, something far more unusual was unfolding in front of them. Judge Whitmore finally looked up again. Her voice carried across the chamber with calm authority. Commander Jackson, according to the documentation here, you are currently assigned to a special operations unit within the United States Navy. The words settled into the room with quiet impact. A few people in the back rows exchanged surprised glances. Someone whispered under their breath, the sound barely audible. Officer Coleman's shoulders stiffened slightly as he heard the confirmation spoken aloud. Maya Jackson nodded once, her movement small but clear. Yes, Your Honor, she replied. Her voice remained steady, respectful, and completely controlled. There was no trace of pride in the answer, no attempt to emphasize the significance of the role she held. She spoke as if it were simply a fact that required acknowledgement and nothing more. Judge Whitmore continued reading for another moment before closing the file gently. You have served for more than 12 years, the judge added, her tone thoughtful, including multiple overseas deployments. Again Maya nodded. The courtroom remained silent. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed quieter now as everyone present processed the information slowly unfolding before them. The judge rested her hands on the bench and looked directly at Officer Coleman. It was not an accusing look, nor was it confrontational. It was simply the calm attention of someone who expected professionalism inside her courtroom. Coleman felt the weight of that gaze immediately. He straightened his posture again, though the confident certainty from earlier that morning had clearly faded. The judge then turned her attention back to Maya Jackson. Commander Jackson, please explain to the court why you are present here today. The question hung in the air for a moment. Maya Jackson placed her hand lightly on the folder resting in front of her. The motion was deliberate and steady, the same disciplined calm that had defined every action she had taken since stepping into the courtroom. She looked toward the judge and answered in the same even voice that had not changed once throughout the entire morning. Your Honor, I am here because I was asked to testify. A faint murmur moved through the gallery once more. The case that had seemed routine minutes earlier now carried a very different weight. Judge Whitmore nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something she had already suspected while reading the file. Across the aisle, Officer Coleman felt the quiet shift in the room, more clearly than anyone else. The woman he had treated as an ordinary participant was now standing before the court as a highly trained officer of the United States military. And as the realization settled deeper into the courtroom, the assumptions that had guided the morning began to unravel one by one. The quiet murmur that followed Commander Maya Jackson's answer slowly faded, leaving the courtroom wrapped again in a careful silence. Sunlight from the tall windows had shifted slightly now, stretching across the polished floor and touching the edge of the defense table where Maya stood with steady composure. Judge Eleanor Whitmore watched her for a moment longer before leaning back slightly in her chair, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. She had presided over countless hearings in her years on the bench, but the situation unfolding in front of her carried a subtle tension that did not belong to routine legal proceedings. The courtroom could feel it. Even the people seated in the back rows sensed that the morning had turned into something far more significant than anyone expected. Judge Whitmore folded her hands together gently. "Commander Jackson," she said, her voice calm but attentive, "the court appreciates your presence. Please clarify the nature of the testimony you were asked to provide." Maya Jackson nodded once in acknowledgement. Her movements remained controlled and deliberate, the kind of calm that comes from years of discipline rather than rehearsed confidence. She opened the folder resting on the table and slid a single document forward, aligning it neatly before speaking. "Your Honor, I was requested by the federal investigative team overseeing this case to provide an official account of the events that took place last month." The statement caused another small ripple through the gallery. A few spectators exchanged curious glances while others leaned forward slightly, eager to understand the connection between a Navy Special Operations officer and a local courtroom hearing. Judge Whitmore listened carefully. "You were present at the incident in question?" she asked. Maya Jackson answered without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor. I was present and directly involved in ensuring that the situation remained under control until the proper authorities arrived." Her voice carried no dramatic emphasis. She spoke with the calm clarity of someone accustomed to reporting facts rather than telling stories. Officer Derek Coleman felt the words settle uneasily in his mind. Earlier that morning he had believed the woman near the defense table was simply another participant in a routine proceeding. Now every sentence revealed a different picture entirely. The woman he had addressed with casual authority was someone who operated in environments far beyond the ordinary boundaries of a courthouse. Judge Whitmore glanced briefly toward the clerk, then back to Maya. "And you were asked to appear today because your testimony could clarify the circumstances surrounding the investigation?" Maya nodded again. "Yes, Your Honor. My role is to provide an accurate record of what occurred and to confirm the timeline that has already been submitted to the court." The judge studied her carefully for a few seconds, then gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The professionalism in Maya's voice matched the documentation she had just reviewed in the file. Around the courtroom, the tension that had once been fueled by confusion now transformed into quiet respect. Even those who had entered the room expecting a routine case could sense that the woman standing before the bench carried experience that few people in the room could fully understand. Officer Coleman lowered his gaze briefly, his thoughts turning over the events of the past hour. The calm restraint Maya Jackson had displayed earlier now made far more sense to him than it had at the time. Across the room, the spectators waited silently as Judge Whitmore adjusted the papers on her bench. The hearing was only beginning, yet the courtroom had already learned something important about the person standing beside the defense table. And as the judge prepared to continue the proceedings, the quiet confidence that defined Commander Maya Jackson remained unchanged, steady as the sunlight stretching across the floor. The courtroom remained wrapped in a thoughtful silence after Commander Maya Jackson finished speaking. Judge Eleanor Whitmore sat upright behind the bench, her hands resting calmly on the polished surface as she considered the testimony that had just been introduced. The light from the tall windows now stretched farther across the room, illuminating the brass rail and the rows of wooden benches where spectators watched the proceedings with growing attention. It was no longer the quiet curiosity of a routine hearing. Something deeper had settled into the room, a collective awareness that the morning's events were revealing more with every passing minute. Judge Whitmore glanced briefly at the clerk, who nodded slightly, as if confirming that the documents on record matched everything the commander had stated. The judge then returned her attention to Maya Jackson. "Commander Jackson," she said in a measured tone, "the court will require a clear timeline of the events you referenced in your statement. Please explain where you were and what occurred on the evening in question." Maya Jackson inclined her head once in acknowledgement. She did not rush her answer. Instead, she took a quiet breath, as though organizing the details in the precise order they had happened. "Your Honor, I was returning from a scheduled briefing at the Naval Operations Office located approximately 2 miles from the Harbor District. While traveling through the area, I observed activity that appeared inconsistent with normal traffic patterns." The courtroom listened closely. Maya continued, her voice steady and composed. "Because the situation raised concerns related to public safety, I remained on site and notified the appropriate authorities. My responsibility at that moment was simply to ensure that the situation remained stable until law enforcement units arrived. The explanation was clear and professional, delivered without exaggeration. Yet the calm confidence behind her words carried a weight that filled the room. Judge Whitmore nodded slightly. And the investigative team later requested your testimony regarding what you observed. Yes, Your Honor, Maya replied. My statement was included in the federal report submitted to this court. A faint rustle moved through the gallery as people shifted in their seats. The connection between the commander's presence and the broader investigation was becoming clearer. The hearing was not simply about an isolated event. It was part of a much larger process that involved multiple agencies and careful documentation. Officer Derek Coleman stood quietly near the aisle, his attention fixed on the exchange taking place at the front of the courtroom. Earlier that morning, he had believed the situation was simple. Now each new detail revealed how incomplete that assumption had been. The woman he had addressed with routine authority was not just a witness. She was someone whose experience and judgment had already played a role in the official investigation now before the court. Judge Whitmore adjusted the papers on her bench and spoke again. Commander Jackson, the court appreciates your cooperation. The clarity of your account will assist in ensuring that the record remains accurate. Maya Jackson nodded once more, her expression unchanged. She did not look toward the gallery or toward the officer standing near the aisle. Her attention remained focused on the judge, exactly where it belonged. Around the courtroom, the earlier uncertainty had transformed into quiet respect. Even those who had entered the room expecting an ordinary proceeding could now sense that they were witnessing the steady professionalism of someone trained to remain calm under pressure. And as the hearing continued, the disciplined presence of Commander Maya Jackson seemed to anchor the entire room in a new kind of silence. One shaped not by confusion, but by recognition. The quiet respect that had settled over the courtroom continued to deepen as the hearing moved forward. Judge Eleanor Whitmore adjusted the papers on the bench once more, then leaned slightly forward as she addressed the room. Her voice carried the steady authority that had guided countless proceedings within those walls. Commander Jackson, the court recognizes the importance of maintaining a clear and accurate record, she said calmly. Your testimony has already clarified several points within the federal report. Maya Jackson nodded once, her posture still composed beside the defense table. The light from the tall windows now reached nearly halfway across the courtroom floor, bright enough to cast long reflections along the polished marble. Outside the courthouse, the distant hum of traffic drifted faintly through the walls, a reminder that the world beyond the courtroom continued moving as usual. Inside, however, the focus remained entirely on the exchange taking place at the front of the chamber. Judge Whitmore glanced toward the clerk, who slid a document across the bench. The judge reviewed it carefully before speaking again. The investigative team has also included your written statement describing the initial observations that prompted you to remain at the scene, she continued. Based on the information presented, it appears your decision to remain until authorities arrived ensured that the situation did not escalate further. The acknowledgement carried quiet significance. In the gallery, several spectators exchanged thoughtful glances. Until that moment, they had only understood fragments of why a Navy commander had been called into a local courtroom. Now the broader picture was beginning to take shape. Maya Jackson responded with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the hearing. Your Honor, my role was simply to observe and report what I witnessed. Once the appropriate agencies arrived, the responsibility for the investigation transferred entirely to them. Judge Whitmore gave a small nod of agreement. That is precisely how the report describes it. She paused for a moment, then allowed her gaze to move briefly across the courtroom before returning to Maya. The court appreciates individuals who understand the value of restraint and accuracy when documenting serious events. The statement seemed directed not only at the witness, but at everyone present in the room. Officer Derek Coleman remained standing near the aisle, his hands now clasped quietly in front of him. Earlier that morning, he had believed the situation was straightforward. Now, listening to the exchange between the judge and the commander, he could feel the full weight of how much he had misunderstood. The calm professionalism Maya Jackson displayed was not simply confidence. It was discipline shaped by years of responsibility in environments where decisions carried consequences far beyond a courtroom. Judge Whitmore closed the document and rested it neatly on the bench. "Commander Jackson," she said, her voice measured, "the court has no further questions regarding your observations at this time. However, your testimony will remain part of the official record as this case proceeds." Maya Jackson inclined her head once more. "Yes, Your Honor." The acknowledgement was simple, yet it carried the quiet certainty of someone who understood that her responsibility had been fulfilled. Around the courtroom, the atmosphere had transformed completely from the uncertain tension that filled the room earlier that morning. What had begun as confusion had now become recognition. The woman standing calmly beside the defense table was not merely a witness, but a professional whose actions had already helped stabilize a critical situation. And as the judge prepared to move the hearing forward, the steady presence of Commander Maya Jackson continued to hold the quiet attention of everyone inside the courtroom. The courtroom settled into a calm stillness after Judge Eleanor Whitmore finished speaking. The moment carried a quiet sense of completion, as though the room itself understood that something meaningful had just unfolded within its walls. Sunlight continued to stretch across the marble floor, reflecting softly against the brass rail and the polished wood of the benches. Commander Maya Jackson stood beside the defense table with the same composed posture she had maintained since the beginning of the hearing. Nothing about her demeanor had changed. She had spoken clearly, answered every question directly, and now she waited with the patience of someone who understood how official proceedings reached their natural conclusion. Judge Whitmore gathered the papers on the bench and aligned them neatly before closing the case file with deliberate care. "Commander Jackson," she said calmly, "the court thanks you for your professionalism and cooperation. Your testimony has been clear and helpful to the record." Maya inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her voice remained steady and respectful. The judge nodded once more before turning to the clerk to address the next procedural step in the hearing. As the attention of the bench shifted toward the paperwork, the quiet focus that had centered on Maya slowly eased across the courtroom. Spectators began to relax in their seats, though many of them continued watching her with thoughtful expressions. What had started as a simple moment of curiosity had grown into something deeper. The room had witnessed the calm presence of someone who carried responsibility far beyond the courthouse walls. Officer Derek Coleman remained standing near the aisle, his posture noticeably different from earlier that morning. The certainty he had carried when the day began had softened into reflection. He looked toward Commander Jackson once more, this time with a quiet understanding that had not existed before. The discipline she had shown throughout the hearing had spoken louder than any explanation. After a brief moment, Maya gathered the folder from the defense table and closed it carefully. Her movements were unhurried, precise, the same controlled motions that had defined her presence from the start. She turned slightly toward the exit, pausing only long enough to give the judge a final respectful nod before stepping away from the table. The soft sound of her shoes crossing the marble floor echoed gently through the room as she walked toward the aisle. Conversations had not yet resumed. Many of the spectators simply watched as she passed, their attention following her with quiet respect. The morning had revealed something they had not expected to see inside a courtroom. Calm authority without arrogance. Discipline without confrontation. Near the aisle, Officer Coleman stepped aside to allow her to pass. Their eyes met for a brief moment. No words were exchanged, yet the silence between them carried an acknowledgement that both of them understood. Maya continued toward the tall wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. Sunlight from the hallway beyond filtered through the glass panels. As she reached for the handle, when the door opened, a brighter wash of daylight filled the entrance. She stepped through it calmly and disappeared into the corridor beyond. Behind her, the courtroom returned slowly to its routine rhythm. Papers shifted, quiet voices resumed, and the judge continued guiding the proceedings forward. Yet for many of the people present that morning, the image of Commander Maya Jackson walking calmly out of the room remained fixed in their minds. It was the quiet reminder that true strength does not need to raise its voice to be recognized.